The 6th of March, 1944. The sky over Berlin and Brandenburg is a pale blue plate cut by white rails. The 8th Air Force comes in stacked and timed B-17 groups from the 1st and 3rd Bomb Divisions, stepping east on the minute, while Lieutenant General James H. Doolittle's order rides in every headset escorts are free to range and kill. Far below Black Flak, buds open and drift, but the real threat forms ahead along radio beacons, where controllers push fighters upward. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Gallen's defense reaches for the contrails with Bf-109Gs and Fw-190, as Staffeln from JG-1 and JG-11, knitting into wedges that once cut daylight open with head-on passes. Above the stream, the cover is lean and bright, P-51 B and C Mustangs from the 4th Fighter Group under Colonel Don Blakesley and the 357th under Colonel Kenneth O. Martin, sliding high into the sun, fuel tallies living in the corner of each pilot's mind like a second altimeter. In the lead box, the air tastes of oxygen and oil. A top turret gunner watches the dark seeds at 12 o'clock swell into shapes and calls them without drama. The navigator's pencil stays on the line. Nobody says the word Berlin. The front element braces chin guns already walking tracer to feel where the pass will come. The wedge of W-190 seconds commits nose steady closure huge. It is the move that taught crews to clench their jaw and wait for the hammering snap of cannon through glass and aluminum. The formation does not flinch wide. It holds. From the sunside bracket, a flight of Mustangs rolls inverted and drops. The cold in the canopy is the kind that burns the teeth. The leader picks the section chief by the way his airplane sits, just a fraction calmer in the pack, and slides the sight ahead of where that calm will turn. The dive is not a pounce so much as a weld. Throttle forward, trim a hair, nose down, a short burst to measure, then a full press that walks into the German's brake. The few 190 should flash through the frame and vanish below. It does not. The silver shape stays in the canopy like a knuckle against glass. In the bomber, the first shells that should have torn a cockpit never arrive. The interphone is clipped and spare, steady, hold, no drift. Outside are 190 peels, with a smear of orange pieces flexing away in the slipstream. A gunner in a waist window feels his shoulders drop a fraction and hates that he notices. The pilot feathers number 2 for a cough that does not become a fire, brings it back and keeps the box tight. The sky does not open. It narrows to a tunnel that still goes east. The German section fractures. One tries to take it vertical, trusting the breakout climb that saved him in 1943. The Mustang follows as if hung from a wire, stays inside the arc-tap's rudder to keep the nose wet and cuts. The radio carries only working words. Splash, shift, cover left. The wingman clears the low 6, drops his tanks when the weight slows his follow-through, and comes back across with a burst that chips paint and will be logged as inconclusive. The point is pressure. The point is that nobody reforms for a clean second pass into the box. A micro-engagement blooms off the lead's left. A second swarm commits late, sees the first break apart in fire and smoke, tries to salvage the geometry with a quick dash across the nose of the high squadron. 2 Mustangs that should have been orbiting close are already there, a bracket that came from the empty air above cloud tops. One takes the high line, one takes the drag, and the German pair is forced into a shallow dive that kills their angle and their nerve. The bombers walk through the gap. They should not have owned guns, still searching but not desperate. In the cockpits, the sounds are small and exact. Oxygen hisses like a saw. A canopy tick becomes a hammer when a glancing hit snaps a strip of metal from a frame. A voice on the bomber command set says, "Bombs on in 11," and does not raise its tone. A Mustang pilot steals half a second to nudge the mixture richer and check the fuel he will need to be here on the egress. The air is full of dust that did not exist a minute before, tiny particles of paint and aluminum shining in the sun like frost. Far below, black bursts climb on thick stalks, too slow to matter to this beat of the fight. A 109 cuts across the top turret's field, close enough that the gunner sees the pilot's shoulders. The chin gunner starts and stops a burst to avoid walking it into the next ship's tail. The 109 dives away and vanishes into glare, not chased by triumph, but shoved off balance by presence. The men in the box breathe again, without telling their mouths to do it. They do not cheer. It is not that kind of day, and not that kind of sky. Behind the first kill, the Mustang leader eyes a fresh clump forming at 2 o'clock and pushes his flight out to cut the climb before it ripens. He says nothing wider than the work. The altimeter unwinds a hair. The engine's note holds. The city is a gray plate ahead, the rail yards flat and geometric, the sun just high enough to hurt. The bomber stream does not bow around the fear it remembers. It proceeds. When the second German pair tries to climb into the re-attack lane, the escorts are already falling through them, and the moment to make a myth of daylight again is gone. The formation's shadow passes over a ring of smoke, where a fighter burned. Nobody looks down. The sky makes a hush that feels physical, a thin air pressure on the ears, and the raid goes on in that silence. By late February 1944, the air war over the Reich tightens into something methodical. Big Week has just demonstrated that heavy bombers can bruise the German aircraft industry, but the price of flying without persistent escort remains obvious to every crew chief chalking names on replacement ships. James Doolittle inherits that ledger and changes the arithmetic. Fighter cover is no longer a sentimental image stuck to bomber wingtips. It becomes a moving net, stretched ahead of the stream above it, and along its egress path, with units rotating by bracket, so that German interceptors cannot form at leisure. The doctrine sounds simple in a briefing room. Its meaning over Berlin is brutal and practical. If Mustangs still have the legs to kill near the capital, daylight ceases to be a gamble and turns into a schedule. The route is known in every ready room. North Sea, Dutch coast, over canals, glittering like threads across North German flats. Then, the darker blocks of Brandenburg, where flak regiments thicken the sky. The bomber stream climbs through high haze into lanes mapped by previous missions' altitude stacks that keep prop wash from shaking formations apart, time on target, windows trimmed to minutes. The 1st and 3rd Bomb Divisions carry the load in B-17 boxes, whose salvation depends on spacing as much as armor. Escort cycles are rehearsed like a dance. The 4th Fighter Group, under Don Blakesley, takes one bracket, the 357th. Under Kenneth Martin pushes deeper. Other groups swap in where fuel margins demand it. Each handoff is a risk. Each successful handoff is one less gap for an ace to exploit. Across the beacons, the defenders assemble with the same discipline. Adolf Gallen's system for Reich defense still counts on head-on slashes to puncture the lead elements of a box before turret arcs can settle. Jagdgeschwader, assigned to the sector, Staffeln from JG-1 and JG-11. Among them climb BF-109, Gs and W-190W, as into the contrails, and wait for the call that the stream has cleared the last heavy flak ring. Pilots who spent the previous year turning unescorted raids into fields of burning aluminum trust a geometry that once felt like a law of nature. A steady approach, cannon at point blank break through the seam, reform for a second, pass while gunners blink the tears out of their eyes. Fuel is tighter now, training pipelines are thin, but the tactic still promises quick kills if the escorts bleed away before Berlin. American crews carry two memories into March. Schweinfurt-Regensburg sits like a weight no speech can lift. At the same time, winter missions with deeper cover have shown glimpses of a different sky. One where a frontal wedge arrives late or fractured because someone up high hunted it apart before it could harden. The promise of Doolittle's order is not comfort. It is pressure applied at exactly the moment the intercept would otherwise become lethal. The cost is obvious, too. Free-ranging escorts will sometimes be out of sight when a box wants them close. A missed bracket exposes a seam. Everyone involved accepts those risks because the alternative is a familiar disaster in slow motion. The stakes compress around a few minutes on either side of bombs away. If long-range escort dissolves even briefly at those points, the old rule returns. The nose of the box becomes a killing zone. Stragglers drift back with engines coughing, and German fighters perform their second and third passes almost at leisure. If escort pressure persists, the intercept never matures. The first pass becomes a one-and-done gamble for the attacker, and the bomber stream holds its nerve long enough to reach the aiming points. That is all the doctrine ever wanted, to trade enemy confidence for time on target. Material reality decides whether doctrine lives. Drop tanks have to arrive in numbers and fit properly. Spare Merlin cylinder heads must move through depots fast enough that a group does not hollow out after 2 hard days. Airfields closer to the channel need the fuel stock to launch, recover, and turn around fighters without stretching schedules into fantasy. On the bomber side, battle damage teams swap control surfaces and nose cones with a speed that looks impersonal, only to someone who has never watched a tired crew chief put a scarred ship back on the line by dawn. The effect is cumulative. A few missions in a row with escorts present at the right places remakes expectations, even if the flak tally stays ugly. German belief bends under the same kind of accumulation. Head-on tactics succeed when the attacker can build a clean run, hold the sight picture for heartbeats, and exit before the box's arcs intersect. Escorts that descend from above and remain inside the break take those heartbeats away. The defenders adapt where they can. Some units thicken their punch with armored Sturm elements to tolerate return fire. Others experiment with rockets to crack a formation from outside its peak density. Each adaptation trades one attribute for another. Heavier fits, cut climb, and acceleration, the very qualities needed to shake an escort that refuses to overshoot. Pilots who once expected clear air after the pass find themselves dragging a silver shape through the turn and into a shallow dive that eats altitude and fuel. Reforming for that decisive second strike becomes a rarity rather than a routine. Inside the American force, fear does not vanish. It gets slotted. Flak remains indifferent to doctrine, and the Berlin belts are thick. Nose-on cannon bursts are still catastrophic if they arrive unopposed. Crews are briefed to hold formation anyway because panic opens seams faster than shells do. Fighter leaders instruct their squadrons to think in terms of denial rather than display. The job is not to be seen alongside the bombers. The job is to make sure the intercept never coheres. That mindset spreads from briefing rooms to cockpit habits. A pilot counts fuel not with heroics in mind, but with the question of whether he can still be lethal at the exit corridor. All of this compresses into the psychological fulcrum of early March. The bomber stream heads for a city that the enemy insists should be safe in daylight. The defenders climb with the memory of 1,943 under their skin and the math of 1,944 written on their boards. The escorts slide into positions that turn theory into minutes stolen from the other side. The outcome is not an epiphany. It is a sky that feels different because the old cadence fails to arrive on time. If the Mustangs are still present when the Norden glass lifts and the release lines cross the yards, the myth that daylight belongs to the defender begins to shrink from a rule into a story told about last year. If they blink off even for a narrow stretch, the story snaps back and everyone in the stream remembers exactly how it ends. The frontal pass earned its reputation because it converted geometry into certainty. A B-17 box throws murderous fire astern and on the quarters, but the cone directly ahead of the lead ships is thinner and harder to keep filled. An Fu-190A, or Bf-109G, that arrives fast nose steady for 2 heartbeats, can pour 20 or 30mm shells through plexiglass and into a cockpit or along the number 2 engine line, and then knife down through the least covered slice of sky before the arcs converge. Crews did not learn this from pamphlets. They learned it from seeing a lead ship suddenly slacken and slide out smoking while the interphone filled with clipped orders no one wanted to hear. In 1943, the pattern looked like a law of nature. Align, fire break, reform, finish stragglers. It worked because the attacker owned the moments before and after the shot. By early March 1944, those moments are contested. The bomber stream climbs into the high 20s over Brandenburg, the air as thin and bright as ground glass flak columns, sprouting black flowers that hang slow and heavy below the contrails. The boxes from the 1st and 3rd bomb divisions hold spacing that is as much survival as discipline. Prop wash and turbulence can open seams faster than enemy shells if someone panics. Ahead and above, the escorts have shifted from guardians to predators. P-51, B and C Mustangs drain and jettison their drop tanks, settle into long controlled dives from high brackets, and arrive inside the German break rather than flashing past it. The distinction is not an airshow flourish. It is the difference between a head-on pass that guarantees a second attempt and a head-on pass that becomes a one-and-done gamble. The German side still begins with practiced economy. Controllers step Staffeln from JG-1 and JG-11 onto beacon lines that point toward the bomber stream as it crosses the last belt of heavy guns. Leaders watch the contrails for the slight swell that marks the lead element check that their spacing gives each pilot one clean sight picture and commit. The revised sight jitters a hair's breadth, with slipstream, then steadies. Hands squeeze, and the airframe thumps as cannon shells step out. For a handful of seconds, the old physics holds closure so high that gunner tracers seem slow. the cockpit framed perfectly by glass and aluminum ribs, the steady line that tells you the burst will land where it must. Then, the frame changes. A silver fighter fills the canopy from above and ahead, sliding across the break with a steadiness that feels unnatural. You bank and pull for the vertical, trusting the breakout climb that worked last year. The shape does not overshoot, it stays. For the bomber crews, the sensation is equally physical. In the nose of a fortress, the world has always narrowed to a vibrating ring when a frontal wedge commits. Chin guns chatter and walk bright beads to find a lead element's skin, and gunners brace for the slamming snap of shells that punch through metal and shock the air with shredded insulation dust. On the March raids, the first pass looks the same until it doesn't. Fire comes thinner than expected, then wavers. An FW-190 peels, with a smear of flame trailing through the white. Another cuts the top of the formation and tries to climb away, and simply fails to accelerate enough to be safe. The interphone stays clipped, steady hold, and the box refuses to blossom into panic. The difference is not courage. It is time bought by pressure, applied at exactly the moment the intercept would have matured. The mechanics of that pressure are simple to describe and hard to defeat. The Mustangs sit high and slightly offset from the stream, energy banked as altitude and speed margin. When a swarm rolls into a frontal run, a flight drops from the sun, side noses down, and aims not at a crossing shot but at the break itself. The pilot keeps the sight a fraction ahead of where the German leader must turn to. Exit trims, nose heavy to avoid the float that would carry him past, and accepts the drag of a sustained tracking burst rather than a snap. Deflection. The result inside the German cockpit is a canopy that will not clear. Every attempt to change plane or speed is matched by a pursuer who has already paid the energy bill for that maneuver. A second Mustang, slightly low and aft, takes the drag line to block the only comfortable downhill exit. The frontal geometry that once made the bomber's nose a weakness becomes the attacker's trap on the climb-out. Constraints on fuel and training magnify the effect. Reich defense relies on pilots who can execute a clean formation pass and then reform quickly under pressure. In March 1944, high-octane fuel is rationed and conversion courses are compressed. Reforming a shattered attack into a disciplined second run takes time many units can no longer buy. Armored Sturmfits promise survival inside the box's fire, but added weight cuts the climb and acceleration needed to shake escorts that refuse to overshoot. Rockets threaten from standoff ranges, but bring their own penalties in drag and handling. Each adaptation solves one problem and worsens another, and all of them suffer when a fight begins with defenders forced defensive in the first 10 seconds. Inside the Mustang, the soundscape is all small necessities. Oxygen hisses. The Merlin's note lengthens in a dive and flattens as the pilot eases back into level to stay with the turn. A burst clatters the airframe with ejected cases. A quick rudder kick keeps the sight walking where it must. Calls are ice-cold splash shift cover left. No one lectures the bombers on what they just did. The escort's job is not proximity theater. It is denial of time of reformation, of the confidence needed to commit again. That denial is why a top turret gunner who used to twitch at the first dark specks finds himself holding a smoother sight and realizes with a flash of guilt that his shoulders are not up around his ears. The flak belts around Berlin still exact their own price, indifferent to doctrine, and crews feel that weight as they watch the black bursts climb on stalks. But flak creates predictable corridors that can be flown through. Disciplined head-on attacks create chaos inside the box that cannot be navigated by maps. When escorts break the frontals into fragments, the path through the flak becomes survivable because the 1-2 rhythm of pass and repass never gels. Gunners report fewer attackers lining up for a deliberate second head-on. Debriefs scribble the same line in different hands. Attackers forced down on breakout. Second runs rare. Most damage from first-pass spray rather than aimed bursts. Repeatability matters more than any single kill film. On 6 March, the choreography unfolds over Berlin frontal wedges form. Mustangs drop attackers peel bleeding before the reform. On 8 March, a similar pattern plays out again. Different clouds, same altitude, same bracket, arriving from above the stream. Same reports that the nose-on threat felt thinner and shorter than expected. These are not miracle days. Weather and timing still punish a late handoff. Some groups still take hard losses. But the curve bends. What had been a dependable rule becomes a conditional proposition. You might win your frontal pass if the bracket is late, if the escorts are short on fuel, if flak forces the cover to widen. The absolutes are gone. For the men strapped into machines, the statistics are less real than the microseconds that decide whether a cockpit fills with smoke. The German pilot who once treated the climb-out as a corridor to safety finds a silver fighter hanging in his peripheral vision like a reflection that should not exist. The American pilot who once clenched his jaw, hearing 12 o'clock high, now listens for a different cue. The top covers calm. Tally the absence of radio panic. The simple fact that the box ahead did not open like a torn zipper. The bomb aimer steadies his voice when he calls time to the run. The lead holds true long enough for the Norden glass to do its job. Survival turns on tiny disciplines, but those disciplines only matter because someone else took away the enemy's second chance. The deadliest envelope for each side settles into clarity. For the defender, it is the climb-out after the frontal shot, when energy is lowest and options are few. If an escort sits inside that arc, the odds invert instantly. For the escort, it is any gap in the bracket, fuel margins misjudged. A handoff missed, when the bomber nose is bare in the worst possible air. Both sides fly with those truths in mind, and both sides bleed when they forget them. Over Berlin, in March 1944, the balance tilts, because one side can choose where to spend energy and when to replace it, and the other is forced to spend it all at once. This is not luck. It is geometry, fuel, and a fighter that refuses to leave the frame. The canopy locks with a dull click that settles in the chest. The controller's vector is clean, the beacons step you east, and the air is the hard kind that dries the eyes even behind the goggles. You ride the throttle forward a notch, and the FW-190's nose hums with a confidence you earned in other months, other raids that broke the day open with one head-on pass. The contrails loom in rungs, each rung a box of B-17 seconds that will not turn aside if you hesitate. The Revy circle flickers, steadies, and the lead ship's chin glitters with flashing guns that have always looked worse than they are from this angle. You tell your section to spread. You breathe like you trained, short, even nose, not mouth. Time shrinks neatly to 2 heartbeats. The first heartbeat is the sight aligned on the corner post of the lead cockpit. The second is the squeeze that makes the airframe thump as the cannons step their way out along the line you drew. Then something disturbs the geometry that has always obeyed you. A glint tears down from the sun, not across your path but inside it. You bank to force the overshoot and feel the harness bite as you pull for the vertical. The silver shape should slide through the canopy frame and disappear below the nose. It does not. It hangs steady in that impossible place, and the wing nearest you winks with the continuous chatter of machine guns. The first hits are polite drumming along the tail, like rain on a roof. The next set is less polite. Aluminum snaps from somewhere behind you with the dry crack of a branch under a foot. You try to make the airplane thin, to knife your profile against the sky, and steal a margin of speed you can spend on the next maneuver. The engine answers, but not with the old eagerness. You chose armor last month, and now you carry it like a promise that pulls at your shoulders. The dive you want is not a dive you own. Down there, the flak is beginning to hatch black flowers, the kind that buy you a second from a pursuer, but not more than that. You glance for your wingman and catch only the dirty smear of a ship, shedding paint and fragments as it rolls over. The radio, that was sharp a minute ago, becomes a set of clipped words with no grammar, 2 call signs, 1 curse, 1 silence. Someone behind you shouts for a break left, and you obey without knowing which direction was safe 2 seconds ago. The silver shape moves with you like a reflection you cannot scrape off. The smell comes late, a blend of hot insulation and something electrical that should not be exposed to air. The harness strap across your ribs saws with each breath. You try the climb again because the habit lives deeper than the doubt, and the nose rises just enough to put the sun in your eyes and ice in the corners of the windscreen. The hits stop as quickly as they began. For one empty moment you think you shook him. The right wing catches a lick of fire that skates to the aileron and vanishes. The airplane is still yours, but the confidence is not. You flatten and run for the nearest burst of flak, as if it were a churchyard wall. The second pass the neat reform into the corridor back at the box is already gone. You say nothing because no sentence fits inside the oxygen mask that does not sound like a lie. Up above and a little behind, a Mustang pilot is breathing on a count he does not think about anymore. He rolled inverted off the bracket when the wedge committed checked that his wingman was still a thumbnail in the top right corner of the world, and let the nose come down as if it wanted the horizon on its own. In the dive, the engine's note stretched into a single thin blade of sound. He did not pick the nearest target, or the easiest. He chose the man whose airplane sat half a degree steadier than the rest, and put the sight not on the fuselage, but on the space that pilot would need to live through his own break. The first burst was a test, a measuring tape thrown across the motion. The second was instruction. He trimmed nose-heavy by a notch to avoid the float that would have lifted him off the line, then let the tracking fire stitch its own sentence. His radio world is small, the words hard-edged, tally, in hot, 1. Shift left, cover high, there is no tone in it. He sees a seam opening off the high squadron and wants to go there, but the fuel state in the corner of his eye is a rule stronger than appetite. He checks mixture, feels the levers detent with gloved fingertips, and leaves the dying 190 to gravity and physics. His wingman slides across the wake and takes the drag line on a second German pair, trying to dive out through the bright gap below the contrails. The wingman does not chase past the point where the bracket ahead would thin. They turn the airplane, with the caution of men carrying water, to a place where others are thirsty. The job is not a tally count. The job is a state of the sky. In the nose of a fortress, the world is smaller still. The bombardier keeps his head near the glass and one hand on the handle that always looks like a toy until it matters. Chin guns chatter in a controlled, hateful stutter, and he restrains the urge to rake wildly across the shape in front of him. The pilot's voice on the interphone is a held thread, steady hold check 2. The navigator draws his pencil along a line it has traced in practice and on maps and in dreams, and convinces his wrist to move as if the airplane were on rails. A top turret gunner swings to follow a 109 that has come too close to the sun and holds fire because the tail of the next ship is inside his sight. He lets the target go and feels the old panic lift a fraction. Restraint that would have made him sweat in autumn is now the right answer instead of an abdication. Someone in the waist feels the hull of the world change. He has lived the moment when a frontal pass turns into a slam of sound and dust and the empty space where a man's voice belonged. He waits for it now with muscles that hurt already. It does not arrive. There is fire in the sky, but it is not his. It curves away like handwriting he does not need to read. He keeps his field of fire clean and refuses to look long at the piece of airplane passing below orange licking at its seams. He knows better than to measure his breathing, but he does it anyway. One slow pull, one slow push, that fogs the mask in a soft rhythm he cannot see. A minute later, the flak makes its own argument, black puffs, stepping up on stalks that are always taller from the cockpit than they looked on the map. The box flies into it, and the formation quivers as the air thickens. The escorts vanish outward and upward thinner than a promise, then reappear where another clump of dark specks begins to build the old shape of a frontal wedge. 2 Mustangs cut down through them before the wedge can harden. The radio inside the bomber remains the voice of steady men counting. The radio in the fighter remains the shorthand of work. The German, who is still airborne, picks his way along the edge of a flak belt and feels the sky tilt against his hands. He tries to assemble names on the radio and gets only fragments. He is not thinking of the second pass anymore. He is thinking about the needle on the fuel gauge that wants to live where the red begins, about the weight of the armor that felt like prudence in winter and like a chain in spring, about the memory of a day when you could trust the air to carry you out of the break like a current. He tells himself that this was one bad merge, that someone somewhere else on the route made a neat cut and lived to file it. He does not believe himself, not completely, and he is careful not to say so. The Mustang pilot shades his eyes against the wash of light and watches a far set of contrails cross the city's edge where the release lines will live in a few minutes. He hears a clipped voice on the squadron net speak the numbers that mean the next bracket is on time. He feels the need to climb and the equally strong need not to. He chooses a middle, a shallow arc that keeps him within reach of the climb-out path of any fresh intercept and within the discipline of his fuel plan. He checks his wingman again and gets a thumbs up that looks like a quick, tired shrug. The sky is full of tiny, bright things, bits of aluminum and paint hanging in sunlight like dust motes in a room that no one has cleaned for years. On the bomber flight deck, the pilot feathers an engine for a cough and brings it back with the unshowy pride of a man who has rehearsed this gesture until it needs no pride at all. The co-pilot reads a checklist that he could speak in his sleep, and sometimes does. The bombardier asks for one more degree of trim, and the ship gives it without complaint. The navigator feels his pencil bite the paper and does not press harder because there is no need, because the line will still be there later, whether or not anyone looks. No one declares a victory. There is no time, and the word does not fit in mouths that are full of oxygen and grit. The German who breaks free crosses under a ragged column of smoke and keeps his eyes on the next flak bloom, because looking anywhere else invites a thought he cannot afford. The American who rolled inverted to start this sequence finds his sight empty of targets and leaves it empty on purpose. The bomber stream moves east like a machine that has learned how to work without speaking about it. Silence becomes the loudest thing. It rides the interphone between short commands and lives under the Merlin's note and sits in the space where panic used to live. It is not comfort, it is not triumph. It is the sound of a sky that has refused to break in the old way and is not finished with the new one. In late winter, 1944, decisions made in a few headquarters rooms begin to express themselves as changes in the air over Germany. James Doolittle assumes command of the 8th Air Force and writes an instruction that seems bland on paper but ruthless in practice. Escorts will range and kill. The implication is that fighters are no longer a comfort blanket stitched to the bomber's edges. They will climb ahead of the stream, sit in the sunside bracket, and strike at the German intercept while it is still congealing. Brigadier General William Kepner's 8th Fighter Command turns that sentence into schedules and handoffs, allocating brackets by altitude and leg, so that a box crossing Brandenburg in the late morning is never alone for the crucial minutes. When head-on attacks used to carve it open, turning doctrine into presence requires plumbing. The P-51 B and C are issued with paper drop tanks that move the phrase long range from promise to routine. Ground crews drill the jettison reflex so that the tanks leave cleanly when a dive is imminent. Depot teams treat engines, radiators, and control surfaces as replaceable modules, not liabilities that must be nursed. A fortress that takes damage on Monday does not vanish to a graveyard for weeks. It disappears for hours or days, then reappears in formation with a new nose cone or a fresh right wing. Fighter groups cycle aircraft and pilots through a timetable that looks less like a duelist's calendar and more like a plant shift sheet. The outcome is not invulnerability. It is a density of sorties sustained long enough to make the escort plan real. On the other side of the net, Adolf Galland keeps faith with the one tool that still promises decisive effect at altitude, the head-on pass. The physics remain sound. A steady approach at very high closure puts shells into a bomber's most delicate spaces and allows a clean break into the stream's least covered lane. But the Reich defense in early March pays for every second it wants to spend. High-octane fuel rations, trim training flights, conversion courses compress. Maintenance officers order miracles out of tired engines and tired hands. To thicken the initial punch, some units fit armored panels and heavy cannon to make Sturm elements that can live inside a box's fire long enough to aim. The trade is immediate. Armor and drag cut the climb and acceleration needed to escape a pursuer who does not overshoot. Rockets offer reach at the cost of speed and handling. The more the Germans invest in a kill at the moment of contact, the less they can buy their way out of the moment that follows. Free-roaming escort becomes a set of behaviors rather than a slogan. Sweeps push a few minutes ahead of the stream to rattle climbouts before they cohere. High brackets wait where the frontal wedge must form to meet time on target. Low cover sits in the drag line of the expected break. Calls on the radio are stripped to task, and fuel bracket, in bracket out, handoff, on the minute, climb to this altitude, drop to that report. The gate, when your tanks say, go or stay. There are no victory laps. Any chase that eats the next bracket is a mistake, even if it yields a gun camera reel. The bombers adopt complementary habits, hold spacing under pressure, resist the urge to weave at the first hint of a head-on, trust that the escorts will make the second pass rare. A leader who can keep the box from blossoming into panic saves more airplanes than a top turret hero with perfect aim. The system has weak points, and everyone knows them. Weather in the high 20s breaks handoffs and scatters cover, drop tanks leak. A squadron running a few minutes late produces a hole in the net big enough for a practiced German Staffel to find. The difference in March is that these failures live as exceptions rather than the daily expectation. When the net holds, the intercept does not vanish, it ages quickly. A frontal wedge that once arrived like a law appears a little later, a little thinner, and the climb out that used to feel safe is suddenly the most dangerous 10 seconds in the sky. Debrief sheets begin to carry the same phrases in different handwriting, fewer coordinated second passes. Attackers forced defensive on breakout. Most losses to flak and chance, not deliberate head-on re-attacks. Command responsibility shows in the willingness to tolerate turbulence while the procedure beds in. Doolittle does not pretend that free-ranging escorts will always be where a nervous bomber crew wants them. He accepts that a dispersed cover looks like less protection until it proves itself by subtraction, fewer clean intercepts, less time given to the enemy to settle the site. Kepner's controllers learn a new rhythm. They are not shepherding bodyguards, they are apportioning energy. Blakesley teaches the 4th Fighter Group to think of the exit corridor as the target as much as the incoming wedge. Kenneth Martin's 357th proves that discipline in fuel calls is not cautiousness, but lethality, deferred to the place it counts. The groups converge on a shared sentence disguised as a checklist: deny time. The German counterlogic is trapped by scarcity. An ace who survives a frontal run is not just a claims machine. He is a fragile repository of training bandwidth that cannot be replaced at speed. A squadron that tries a Sturm fit can crack a lead element, but when escorts sit inside the break, the heavier airplanes are slower to live through the next 10 seconds. Rockets punch at a box and make gunners duck. They also prevent the quick reset required to cut again. Even when a pass draws blood, the lack of a composed second run means the outcome feels like a raid of chance rather than a practiced harvest. The result is not collapse, it is fray. The intercept arrives more often as single flashes and slashes than as a serrated sequence. In that space, bomber discipline works. Fear becomes a thing crews name in the briefing and budget for, rather than a surge that drives hands to the wrong controls. Standard operating procedures crystallize because they are written by repetition, not by memos. Fighter sweeps check the climb corridors by habit. High-low brackets become muscle memory. One pair takes the leader's exit. One pair waits a beat for the wingman who always tries to dive shallow. The word splash carries no music. It is an accounting entry that frees a flight to slide left and cover the next build. Fuel gates harden into rules, stronger than appetite. A pilot who burns past the gate to chase a kill knows he empties a space that another man needed filled. Over days and then weeks, these micro-disciplines drag the air war in daylight toward a new equilibrium, where the defender's best tactic is still dangerous but rarely decisive. Bomber procedures are equally prosaic. Hold means hold. Don't open the casket when the frontal wedge appears. The men in the top turrets cannot cover the nose better than a steady formation can protect itself by geometry. The interphone stays clipped because language can only hurt in the seconds when hands must do exactly what they train to do. Engine coughs are treated as maintenance problems to be managed, not omens that demand improvisation. The bombardier does not shorten a run because fear changes his breathing. He holds the line to the aiming point because escorts have turned terror into pressure felt elsewhere. Industrial depth explains why one side can afford to act like this. A lost Mustang is a form that a depot begins to refill before the empty chock cools. A wounded pilot returns to a pipeline that does not end abruptly in a bottleneck. A bomber with a punched nose sets off a chain that delivers a new assembly without appeals to saints. None of this makes the men on the line less mortal. It makes the plan less brittle. On the other side, attrition of skill and the hunger of the airframe pull in the same direction. Every pilot who fails to return is a wound to a unit's competence and its nerve. Every airframe that claims a kill at the price of being too heavy to escape takes a debt that the next mission has to pay with interest. Doctrine filters down to sentences that sit in mouths without rhetoric. Do not circle fight anything that climbs better. Dive and extend. Do not burn fuel proving a point. Spend it stopping a second pass. Do not chase across the egress lane. Be there for the climbouts. For the bombers, do not weave at the first glint. Hold because your escorts are turning the old certainty into a rarity. The men who fly these sentences do not need to love them. They need to repeat them until the war's arithmetic changes. By early March, the arithmetic looks different over Berlin. Not safe, never safe, but different. The place where German fighters once counted on 2 clean tries shrinks to a first swipe under pressure and a messy attempt to live through the turn. The place where American crews once braced for a ritual of disaster becomes a corridor of flak, where discipline matters more than panic. The air still kills. It kills more slowly in the way that a system begins to starve an opponent rather than knock him down with a single theatrical blow. Daylight starts to sound like an assembly line. Germany is forced to guard a flying museum. The myth breaks in small, humiliating ways before anyone writes it down. It breaks when a swarm rolls to meet the lead box over Brandenburg and finds silver shapes already inside the turn they planned for the exit. It breaks when a veteran lines up ahead on and the pass still feels good. The sights steady the shells, walking in until the moment the break should grant safety and does not. It breaks when men who used to file claims on unescorted raids begin to count seconds aloud as they try to live through the climb-out eyes, flicking to the fuel gauge, hands light on a stick that suddenly feels heavy. No one announces anything. The change arrives as a pressure on the habits that made daylight belong to the defender. Early March gives the shape a location and an altitude. The bomber stream crosses the last black rings and spreads its shadow over Berlin's yards. The old cadence ought to click into place. Frontal wedge, break, reform, second pass, stragglers carved away. Escorts ought to thin or vanish this deep same as last year. Instead, the Mustangs drop from high brackets with energy to spare and manners that make the horizon feel close. They do not salute the pass and peel away. They ride the break like a rail and trace the climb out like a pen on paper. The German leader feels the canopy fill with a pursuer, tries to take the fight vertical, and finds that the air will not give him the room he once owned. The wingman, who counted on slashing across the corner of the box, glances up and sees a silver belly exactly where the re-attack path begins. Choices sharpen to two, flee toward flak, and hope the bursts rattle the pursuer off, or try the second pass and accept that it will happen under a gun camera. On the ground, the language cools first. Debriefs at 8th Fighter Command stop sounding like weather reports and start sounding like a factory ledger. Fewer coordinated second runs, attackers forced defensive on breakout, escorts lethal near target and along egress. The brevity is the point. When a machine begins to do the same work every day, you stop telling stories about it. In German rooms, the notes run in a different tone but point the same way. Reform under pressure proves difficult. Losses among experienced leaders create holes that training cannot fill at speed. The head-on is still dangerous. It no longer guarantees a composed encore. The more armor you bolt on to live inside the box's fire, the less life you buy when a fighter sits on your shoulder through the turn. In cockpits, the recognition is embodied. A German pilot who has never feared the first pass begins to dread the seconds afterward. He hears the clack-clack of rounds on skin and thinks not of damage inflicted, but of drag taken, altitude lost, options closed. He has a place where he likes to be 2 breaths after firing a slope, a speed, a line toward a new formation, and he cannot find it with a Mustang stitching the air at his 9 o'clock. The American pilot, who once burned fuel in anxious orbits, finds himself counting down to a bracket handoff and seeing it materialize on the minute. He learns to trust a rule that says, do not chase across the egress lane. Be there instead with your energy in the bank when they try to make the second pass. He says little on the radio. That is not an instruction. His kills read like inventory changes, 1 gone shift, left cover high. Bomber behavior changes because fear becomes measurable. The moment when a lead box used to open like a hand under a hammer is still tense, but it does not explode into improvisation. The crews feel it before they admit it. The chin gunner keeps the muzzle short. The pilot trims instead of weaving. The navigator's pencil keeps its line under the same quiet as yesterday. On good days, the only violent motion inside the airplane is from flak, and flak can be flown through. The box survives the first pass intact more often than not, and that fact is enough to turn breathless seconds into a timetable again. The myth of always dies as abruptly as a burst, replaced by the dull math of sometimes. The defenders adjust at the edges where adjustment is possible. Armor stays on some airframes because it makes sense when you expect to sit in the box's teeth for 2 heartbeats. Rockets go up on rails where they promise a crack from standoff. Both choices cut into the climb and accelerate the need for flak to finish the argument. The instinct to mass and re-attack meets a sky that refuses to grant the time to do it. New habits spread faster slashes, aimed at nerves rather than structures, dives toward belts where bursts might break an escort's sight picture, earlier calls to knock it off when fuel states creep toward red. The language of the hunt thins into the language of survival. In the American headquarters, the caution does not fade even as procedure hardens. Weather and timing still punish carelessness. A late handoff still writes a thin paragraph of names on a chalkboard. But the doctrine survives these shocks because the machine that carries it is wide and deep. A bracket missed today is not a reason to undo the rule. It is a prompt to tighten tomorrow's gate. A fighter lost to a reckless chase draws a hard lesson that is repeatable. You emptied the space another man needed and gave away the thing that starves the enemy time. The acceptance of limits reads like humility from the outside. It is in fact aggression redirected to the moment that matters most. The collapse of belief is never total. It is specific and enough. The old sentence ace-led frontal passes can always tear open a daylight raid near the capital becomes a conditional clause inside men's heads. You can still do it if the bracket is late, if the escorts are short on fuel, if the cloud ceiling plays tricks, if flak forces the cover to widen. The list of ifs grows long, while the list of guarantees shrinks. The men who flew in 1943 feel the loss like a bruise in the hands. The men who started in 1944 accept the new world as the only one they have known. The bomber stream, once a pilgrimage through a gauntlet, begins to feel like a commute through hostile weather. No one writes an epitaph for a tactic. They change checklists instead. Handoff times tighten by a minute. Fuel gates get announced twice. A line appears on a briefing board that says the exit corridor is an objective. In the German rooms, another kind of line appears. Avoid prolonged engagements outside flak cover. Do not attempt a second frontal without certainty of escort absence. Conserve experienced leaders for sectors where odds are tolerable. The sky is still lethal in every direction. It is less hospitable to the script that promised decisive returns on the first push. It looks unglorious up close. Gun cameras show kills taken in the unromantic posture of men finishing work. Debriefs carry no adjectives that would sell posters. The city beneath remains a hard target, the belts of black rising in the old climbing forms. But the sense of ownership changes. The bomber stream arrives over Berlin, with escorts still lethal, and the defenders feel the air tilt against their wrists. What was a rule becomes a risk. What was a ritual becomes a try. From Berlin onward, the head-on was no longer a rule, it was a risk paid in 10 seconds. In the hours after the raid, the ledger looks plain. Debriefs at fighter control repeat the same phrases until they feel like parts numbers, fewer coordinated. Second passes. Attackers force defensive on breakout escorts, present near target and along egress. Gun camera reels show kills taken not in knife-edge heroics, but in that unromantic posture, tracking fire through the climb-out. A silver wing steady, where the exit used to be free. The bomber divisions clear their boards for the next scheduled block, as if the city were a destination on a timetable rather than a dare. Crews sleep in fragments. Ground men strip and patch noses and leading edges until dawn. Swap engines on frames that still smell of burned paint, and chalk a return to line that reads like a vow without words. Inside 8 Fighter Command, the handoff gates tighten by minutes. The briefing slide that used to carry a slogan now carries a rule: shoot the exit. Range sweeps move up by a few miles to catch an intercept forming. An egress cover gets a box around it on the map, like an objective. Fuel calls are read back with the same tone as altitude. Anything that empties the next bracket earns a sentence in a squadron room with the door closed. There is no rhetoric for this. The language is all arithmetic. The bombers mirror the change. The word hold gets underlined. Lead crews rehearse keeping a box tight when the nose flashes with the old threat. A pilot who starts to weave is corrected before he finishes a sentence on the interphone. Fear is still present. It is filed into a checklist slot where it cannot run the airplane. Across the line, the adjustments are quieter and sharper. Controllers vector fighters toward belts where flak will complicate an escort's sight picture. Sections that once planned to carve the lead element now teach themselves to slash once and let the bursts below take over. Armor stays on some machines because 2 heartbeats inside a box still exist. But leaders speak more often about getting home with fuel to spare, about saving men whose names the roster cannot replace. The second pass becomes a word spoken with a conditional clause: if the bracket is late, if the weather pins them, if the flak opens a lane. The ifs multiply as the week goes on. Within a few days, the pattern hardens. The 8th schedules another Berlin strike on the board without the old superstitious buffer, sliding the stream into the same lanes and the same hour as if routine were a weapon. Reports return with the same spare lines head-on, shorter re-attack rare. Most damage from first-pass spray and flak. The numbers are not a boast. They are the texture of a sky, in which the decisive moment has been moved to a place the defender does not own. Aircrew talk about it as if describing weather. The Mustang is where it needs to be when the enemy tries to climb after the pass. The box is still tight when the flash at 12 o'clock comes and goes without the ritual of collapse. 2 weeks stretch, and the doctrine becomes habit. Bracket high, shoot the exit, cover egress is no longer a teaching phrase. It is a reflex that shows up unbidden in the way a pilot trims for a dive or counts fuel at the gate. In German rooms, a different reflex appears: brake sooner, use the belts, conserve leaders. The myth does not vanish, it thins. The city remains a hard target. The flak remains indifferent. But the feeling that daylight past the capital belongs to the defender drains away raid by raid until it survives only in the moments when weather lies or timing slips. The psychology is simple enough to fit into 2 short sentences, whispered over maps and mugs. On the American side, fear turns into a checklist. On the German side, power turns into a burden that must be preserved. What follows is not triumph but persistence. The bomber stream walks its line. The escorts spend energy where it subtracts the most seconds from the other side. The defenders circle the belts and wait for if to arrive. After Berlin, daylight is no longer a prayer to be tested. It is a schedule, and schedules wear down what remains of a legend.